and we now see some full-size trams again. This is Glasgow, which you'll see more of. That car, 1115, is now preserved at Christ's Tramway Museum. These were maximum traction bogie cars built in the middle to late 20s. Glasgow's version of a London tram, although the ends weren't as neat. And 10 years later they were building cars like this, the famous Glasgow Coronations, complete with lady driver. Like some towns during the war, not London, but a few towns and cities had women drivers, and Glasgow maintained a policy of recruiting women even in the 1950s. But Glasgow had hundreds of these four-wheel standard cars that started life as open toppers, open-ended, acquired windscreens, vestibules, cover-top decks, high-speed motors, air brakes. Some of them lasted 60 years before they were scrapped. The box on the top of the controller is an interlock box for the air brakes. In the early days of air brakes, I had a lot of trouble with drivers locking their wheels, coming round to emergency electric braking, which of course wouldn't work because the wheels were locked. So when they modernised these cars in the 20s and 30s, they put these interlock boxes on the top, so as soon as you came round to electric notches, it exhausted all the air out of the system. These were trams they bought from Liverpool, and the car following behind was the last type of modern car they built after the war, known as Cunadas. Now we're going to show you the whole of the film I took in 1959. We arrived there in August at tea time, right in the peak period, with trams everywhere, including lots of standards. That's a Coronation driven by a big girl. That's the Cunada, the post-war version, and a wide variety of rolling stock on the main road. A Coronation clatters over the junction. Another Coronation, a Cunada behind it, and they were still painting the newer cars there because the system still had 3 years to go. Cunada loading up, and a ex-Liverpool green Goddess pulling up behind it. If you look at the indicator boxes on the Goddess, you'll see it's all jammed up with sealing material to keep the water out. The Liverpool cars, although roughly the same age as Glasgow's Coronations, were nowhere near as substantial. And after a couple of years at Glasgow, they found that they'd bought a bomb. They were falling to pieces. The equipment was nice, and they were high-capacity cars, but the bodywork was very fragile. You can see this car's been strengthened up with steel strapping running top to bottom. There's a Kilmarnock bogie car, as I said, their version of a London tram. These were kept on the main straight shipyard routes. They had some trouble with them on the Paisley routes, or derailments at junctions. There's a brand new Cunada, or brand new design, followed by a 40-odd year standard. Yeah, some of the crews didn't like the modern cars. They preferred to stand out on these standard cars. There were electric points at Glasgow, but often terminal points like this, which were short working on another route, the points were manually operated. But of course they were bow collector cars, so there was no messing around with trolley poles, etc. The gentleman standing in the road is not blowing his nose. That's Terry Russell, a well-known modeller, also taking cine. quite accidentally we discovered that this was the last day of this particular route, number 16, although it didn't involve any track abandonment. Had it done so, I expect there would have been a lot more enthusiasts around. There was a hole in the roof for maintenance men to inspect whatever, and I stuck my cine camera through there above my head. This was the other end of the route, it's a turn off from the main road. Quite a nice idea because it freed the main tram route for through traffic and also kept pedestrians away from motor cars. Quite a frequent service. And of course, although the last day of Route 16 the cars were being transferred to other routes, hence their reasonably smart appearance. In fact, there are several cars in this film that have just come out of the works after fully repaints. A Q-Marlet bogie crashes its way across the junction towards town. Although the Cunards were newer, most people preferred this design, the 1937 Coronations. Again, a young girl driver. The Q-Marlet bogie rattles across on its way to Dalmuir West. The other end of this route was at a place called Auchinshuggle, which took me about 3 years to pluck up courage to actually ask for that when I paid my fare to the conductress. That is a private bus, Scottish Motor Traction, not corporation. This was the year of the Scottish Industrious Fair, which was held at Kelvin Hall, which is to the right. And we understand the Glasgow Museum of Transport is shortly going to move to this site. They're going to recreate a tramway street. Now this is a contrast. This is the centre of the city on a quiet Sunday morning. Now Route 30 was interesting. It had some of the oldest cars and some of the newest track. At one end there was a 1949 extension on reserved track, but it's worked by these older cars because of sharp curves and tight clearances at the other end of the city. But the following day this area will be jammed tight with vehicles and people, and being the main commercial centre of Glasgow. This is St George's Square. And the trams were very well lighted in Glasgow, and people travelled quite short distances on them and paid their fare. Some people would go a couple of 100 yards on a tram rather than walk because the service was so good. There was a tram every few seconds. This is the other side of the town at MOSSPARK Boulevard, which we called the posh area. It had some reserved track, which all the enthusiasts filmed. But there was quite a long stretch of the street running on this route, and we decided to film that also. It was quite a middle-classy area. And by this time in 1959, it was unusual to see an old car on the route. They tried to keep the best cars on Route 3. This was the famous reserved track section along MOSSPARK Boulevard itself. But a few hundred yards behind the camera, the trams turned out and ran through the street back to the centre of the city. This, of course, was a roadside reservation rather than the normal British tramway idea of an arterial road with the trams on the centre strip. There's a car leaving the street route and joining the side reservation. We walked back to town on the street route. As I said, quite a well-to-do area. Even the mayor of the city lived on this route. Or in Glasgow, of course, known as the Lord Provost. The Lord Provost's house is about where that motor car is parked down on the right hand side. To the left there's the house with two huge lamps. That is the Lord Provost's house. And there was a lot of city councillors lived on this route as well. This was our room at the YMCA hospital where we stayed, and I think you'll find during the course of the film you'll see this crossover used in both directions. But this is obviously a Sunday morning with not too much traffic around. This is another main road in Glasgow, the Great Western Road. There is a car just out the paint shops. Immaculate. The Cunarder looking slightly grubby. Probably due for overhaul. Standard taking it easy over the junction, but on straight track they were quite fast cars. A paved reservation, probably put in as an afterthought. Of course, any defects in the track a four-wheel car will find them, especially a double-deck four-wheel car. This was a reserved track route, again a roadside one, out to Arden. It did go for another few miles to a place called Crosstobs. It was cut back in the middle 50s when they decided to terminate tram routes at borough boundaries. Now, at this time, cine cameras were still quite a novelty, and up at the terminus was a standard car. And the driver saw our cameras and said, "Oh, I'll take it easy for you." We said, "Oh, no, this is movie." "Oh," he said. "Okay then," he said, "I'll belt it up a bit and you can see the results in a moment." That's the tram terminus. The reserve track over the brow of the hill was being taken. There is the standard car at the terminus. It's tram number 812, which is now at Christ's Tramway Museum. So we positioned ourselves to film this standard car coming back to this first stop into town. We wondered how it ever stayed on the track. He was going so fast he went right past the stop. Sand everywhere, people running like hell to catch it. No wonder they had to spend £40,000 overhauling that car at Christ's. Again, we've decided to film a section on the street track. Most tramway enthusiasts got to the reservation and that was it. There was a route off to the left here to a place called Carnwadrick, which was the last street track route built in Glasgow, quite late, 1949, but I believe it was only used at peak hours. We never rode it. We decided to have a look at the new diesel trains of Thornybank Station. Glasgow, of course, was mainly an industrial city, but there were some nice suburbs. There's a fairly new diesel set which had replaced the steam trains a year or so earlier. Because the Cunarder cars were inside frame trucks, hence that guardrail along the side. Here we have a 50-year difference in tram car design. A standard car passing a Cunarder. The Cunarders were built between 1948 and 1952. The last one built is preserved. There is also another car preserved at Christ's Tramway Museum. This is how to upset a car driver by standing out in the road, two of you, side by side with cine cameras. And you'll notice the tram driver shuts off power. That was an instruction at Glasgow. Whenever they were overtaken by a motor vehicle, they shut off power to be prepared for any emergency braking that might be necessary. The favourite view of any tramway enthusiast in the top seat. There's a trolley bus going by in the background and a corporation bus ahead of us. Plus something you didn't see every day. There's a car turning to take up the number 3 route. And we are now about half a mile from the centre of the city. Back to our bedroom at the YMCA. But an overhauled Cunarder car, which gives you the accurate roof colours. But now, of course, it's a weekday, so there's a lot more traffic around. We heard the rumble of a standard, followed by a stream of traffic which probably held up all the way down the road. But as standard cars were becoming thin on the ground, we filmed almost everyone we saw. Now, the junction we saw at the start of the film at St Vincent Street on a Sunday morning, this is the same junction during a normal working day, taken from the upper floor of a restaurant, but somewhat more busy than earlier. Girl driver clanging a gong like mad going around the corner. Obviously the start of the 5 o'clock going home rush. How not to drive a tram. On, off, on resistance notches. I don't know what he was doing. He didn't know he was being filmed, obviously. Full parallel for a second, off again. 2 hands on the handle, though it's not necessary. Another route that's turned off the main road. Actually pulled up outside some factory gates. Well, they actually let me drive this one, and the driver got quite worried when he saw my friend was filming. We thought we were from a London TV station. Archaic way of changing the blinds leading out of the top deck window of the car. Nice job on a wet day. Well, as I said, most crews prefer to work these standard cars rather than the more modern cars. I think the modern cars had very low slung driving cabs, very cramped, and they felt vulnerable in case of a road accident. Whereas the standards were a more solid steel dash plate in front of them, and they could step back if they hit anything. Everything's gone, the trams, the cars, the steam loco on the bridge. Well, that is not a railway bridge, that is a canal up there. And Maryhill Road was renowned for a famous pub known as the Old Tramcar Vaults, which had a model horse tram for a sign and a rather nice etched mirror inside showing 2 or 3 types of Glasgow tram. And also it was the route on which a lot of Liverpool cars were used, the 29. This is a Liverpool car clattering across the junction. Glasgow bought 46 trams from Liverpool on 3 types of bogies. E&B heavyweights, E&B lightweights, and mainly on Taunton swing links, which is what this car has. But by 1959 they decided the Liverpool cars were going, and most of them looked a bit scruffy. By 1960 they'd all gone. Except one, of course, which is preserved. Now back to Liverpool condition. Some of the gilt had worn off these coronation cars, some of what I call the Odeon fittings, but they were still nice vehicles, even at this late time. The pub is still there, but I believe the inn sign has gone. I think it was stolen but later returned, and I believe it's in their museum. Maryhill Road rather, led to quite an extensive tramway junction, a 5-way junction, which was completely relaid a few months after this film was taken, and only lasted another 2.5 years before it was torn up. But there's trams everywhere. Back to the bedroom again, this time the crossover being used in the other direction. Some reckless driver overtaking the tram on the wrong side. It was perfectly legal. It wasn't in some towns. A rush hour scene on a Kilmarnock bogie car. They had their transverse seats replaced with longitudinal seats during the war, and they weren't altered afterwards. Again, the commercial area of the city in the tea time rush hour. The route in front of us was only used for rush hour cars. London would call these extras, but Glasgow called them specials. A reasonably presentable standard, followed by an immaculate coronation fresh out of the works. Bit tight between the tram and that lorry. We're again approaching an outer suburb of the city known as Baillieston. Behind the camera there was a reserved track route to a small town called Airdrie. But that was one of the cutbacks of 1956, the borough boundaries. There is a Liverpool car with E&B heavyweight bogies. A cleaned up version of a design first used in London. You can see the car body is heavily strapped to hold it together, plus the Bostik round the windows. We call them the Bostik Wonders. But they were fast cars with a high capacity. Most of the public liked them, but the crews didn't. Again on the same route, heading back towards town, with new bungalows being built on the left and a farm still operating on the right with livestock in the fields. Seems so unusual to see city trams running down the road with livestock. I stood in the doorway of one of the new bungalows to take this shot. I would suspect the whole area is built up now. Again, the start of the rush hour with extra standard cars being brought out to help out. Again, through the city centre and out the other side was Mary Hill Terminus. Again a cutback on a longer route that went out to Milngavie. But about 500 yards behind the camera there's Mary Hill Depot, and these are some rush hour cars being brought out to turn round to go back to town. Again, quite a nice area, a pleasant park, wide roads. A Liverpool car looking decidedly grotty, obviously washed in stages. And Maley and Taunton heavyweight or swing link bogies. Another cutback route. Later became part of a trolleybus service. Glasgow was late in introducing trolleybuses. The first routes operated in 1949. This is Parkhead Cross, which always had a haze about it, an industrial smoke-filled haze. There's a car coming out from Dalmarnock on Route 30. It will then take a sharp bend to our right. A very tight bend indeed, which is the reason they couldn't operate the bogie cars on this route, despite their beautiful reserve track at the outer end. Car clatters across the points, driven by a lady, the conductor giving a left-hand signal. Well, this time visiting motorists were becoming unfamiliar with trams. There's the tight curve at Parkhead Cross, which restricted this route to four-wheelers. I think it was the overhang of the bogie cars that there's a problem. They certainly could have negotiated the curve quite easily. Clippy changing the seats just before a terminus. This is at Broome House, terminus of the 29s. Mainly worked by Liverpool cars at this time. On these outer sections, a lot of trams didn't like stopping. I remember saying to my friend, well, I'll take a shot of this tram stop and you get in on the tram. The tram driver didn't really want to stop. I just caught it. Heading back along Algar Street towards the central station. This is the area where we first started the film. One time in Glasgow there was a standing rule which didn't apply on the last car at night. And I think this sees where near this junction they stopped a tram and they counted 150 passengers on a 60-odd seat car, and they thought that was a bit much. So that facility was withdrawn. Also, Liverpool cars suffer from sagging platforms, as you can see in that shot. Now we're going to have a look at the other end of Route 30 from a standard car. And this route was only 10 years old when I filmed it. In other words, this reservation was laid down in 1949. A brand new tram route worked by the oldest cars.